Missed an episode of your favorite podcast? Choose from over a decade of content in our archives, not just the latest episode. All free at GCNlive.com.
This is your call to action. Get prepared, America. Economy, survival, energy, disasters. This is USAPrepares.com. Informative radio, educational radio. Interact now by emailing instructor@usaprepares.com or text at 434-390-7953. Class, please take your seats. Now, your instructor, Vincent Finelli.
Everyone all set, cocked, locked? Here we go. Your dial set correctly to USA Prepares. Thank you for being in class with us today. Jason is engineering the broadcast in Minnesota. I'm Vincent Finelli, and we may be able to take a few calls. And so if you have the number, you can give us a call. And if you'd like to listen on the telephone listen line, 605-477-3249. Dr. Richard Allen Miller's with us. Welcome, Rick.
Good morning.
Good morning, Rick.
Yeah.
Rick, if it's okay with you, before we get into today's discussion regarding Newspeak, I think it'd be great to give a tip on how to save money. Is that okay with you? It has to do with physics.
Sure.
Okay. So, class, most of us buy gasoline. And I was thinking about the hot weather. And here's a really simple tip for you. And this will save money for you every time you buy gas. Now, assuming that you find the lowest priced gasoline station and you buy the correct grade of gasoline for your car, assuming you do all that, then this next step applies. And all you have to do is pay attention when you go to buy gas. So all liquids have something in common except for one, and that would be water. So take water out of this equation. But all other liquids expand when they are warmed and get smaller in terms of volume when they're cooled. So, for example, gasoline, if you were to have a gallon jug and you put a line, you say, okay, this is exactly 1 gallon. And gallon is by volume, it's not by weight. And you fill up this, like a wine jug, for example. And you fill that up to the line with gasoline. And you do that when it's cold. And then you warm it up in the sun. And you put the cap on it to make sure none evaporates. You'll find that the gasoline would rise above that line as it gets warmer. So if you know that, and if you believe that that's true, by the way, is that true, Rick?
I don't know, but I do know that we get most of our gasoline from Canada and Mexico, not Saudis.
Okay. So when you buy gasoline, what you do is you buy it early in the morning, and you try to avoid buying gasoline from gas stations that have tanks outside, because if they have the tanks outside, the gasoline bakes in the sun and it expands. So when you buy a gallon of it, you get, we'll call it, less dense gasoline. But if you buy it early in the morning, when the gasoline has not had a chance to warm up, you'll get more gasoline for your dollar. Does that make sense, Rick?
Well, unless they add alcohol. Then it goes downhill from there. Roughly 19 gallons of gasoline can be refined from a barrel of oil, which contains around 42 gallons of crude oil. But, who cares?
All right. So what you do is the gasoline you buy should come from underground tanks, because that way it's cool to about 55 to 60 degrees all the time. And you want to avoid buying gasoline when that tanker is delivering the gasoline to the gas station. And the reason for that is normally the sun is baking the gasoline tanker truck, so the gasoline is being warmed up. And then, that's one part of it. So you get less gasoline for your dollar when you do that. The next thing that's bad is when they dump that gasoline out of that 3-inch hose into the 5,000 underground tank or above ground tank, it causes turbulence, and it puts into suspension all the debris at the bottom of the tank. So when you pump the gasoline, you get that debris in your tank, which will clog up your fuel filter. So that's another thing that you want to do. You want to avoid buying gasoline while or just after the gas station has had a delivery. The next thing you want to do is never let your fuel tank get below a quarter of its capacity. And the reason for that is you will have sludge and a little bit of moisture in your fuel tank and some debris. And if you let your fuel tank get low, you will start sucking up more and more of that on the filter at the bottom of your fuel tank, which most cars and trucks have electric fuel pumps. And when that clogs up, there is no replacing many of them. You have to replace the fuel pump, which means you have to take the gas tank out. Now, on some vehicles, that means that you take the bed off the truck. And I'm not exaggerating. So you get 6 guys, you unbolt the bed, you lift the bed off, and then you can get to the gasoline tank and unscrew the cap to put in the new gas pump, fuel pump, and fuel filter. So if you avoid all that by not letting your gas gauge get below a quarter of a tank. And the idea behind some of that is the debris in the tank gets picked up by the fuel filter in the tank, and also the gasoline in the tank cools the electric pump. So as the electric pump gets hotter and hotter and hotter, it wears out faster and faster and faster. Any comments about that, Rick?
Well, no. I mean, it all makes sense other than what happens to the sludge at the bottom of the tank? Do you have to worry about that?
Well, it stays there. It stays there until it's removed. And how is it removed? Well, it attaches itself to the fuel filter at the bottom of the fuel pump. And that's a problem. So what can happen is you can drive along, and then all of a sudden your car stumbles, and then it won't go. The engine won't run. And then you scratch your head, you look under the hood, and you say, well, the battery's still there, the belts are still there. Well, look, everything looks okay, and then you scratch your head a little longer, and you get on your cell phone, you make a few phone calls, and 20 minutes later you go, well, let's try it again. And you go start the engine, it starts right up. And that's because the fuel, the slight motion in the tank just lifted off a little bit of the debris so that you could get some fuel being picked up by the fuel filter, and then you're good for another 20 minutes until it stalls again. So that was one of the things I wanted to talk about, before we get into, a lot of people, we learned about the moon landing, but what about before the moon landing, or the alleged moon landing? What about what happened before that? Rick, remember in the 1930s, we were interested in putting a satellite in space, and we weren't very good at rocketry, so we sent a few spies over to Europe, and we were able to copy some of Wernher von Braun's designs, and we brought them back to the United States. As a matter of fact, his rocket was called the V rocket, or the V1. So we copied that design and made a rocket. Do you remember that?
No, I thought it was Stanley Kubrick that did that.
Okay. Well, I thought it was.
You think that, I mean, he came out and said he did. Right?
Well, that was in like the 80s, right?
And now they're preparing the same capsule to do a reflight back to the moon. Did you see that article yesterday?
I did, and there's a lot of discussion about this, and that's why I thought we should set the record straight. So Wernher von Braun was experimenting with rocketry in Germany in the 1930s, and he was having some success, but some of the rocket, well, actually his trajectory is a little different than what we needed. His trajectory is like from one city to another, or the countryside to a city, and the idea was to put an explosive on the tip of the rocket, launch it, and when it landed, it would explode. And like England was, one of his favorite destinations. So I mean, that was the plan. Well, so we couldn't build rockets worth a darn. So we copied his design, and we had to modify it because we didn't want the rocket to go like a bullet would travel horizontally. We wanted it to go straight up. So we built what was called the McKinley rocket. And it was named after, well, we couldn't name it after Wernher von Braun because he wasn't an American. So we named it the McKinley rocket. And it was named because Mount McKinley is about 3.8 8 miles above sea level. So all we had to do was get this rocket to go, 5,781 times higher than Mount McKinley. That's all we had to do. And the interesting thing was, what would we put on top of this rocket? Well, we were going to build our first satellite, but it really wasn't an electronic satellite. It was just like a repeater. Actually, it was a reflector. Remember that? Remember how we built the first satellite called Echo?
I don't remember any of that. I thought it was Sputnik, and it was the Russians. And that's why
the Russians,
we were on a race of some kind. Don't you remember we were trying to see who could get there first? But I remember seeing the moon one day with a big black eye when that missile hit it. And I don't remember whatever happened after that.
Well,
something about Germans or something.
That's a really good point, because now if you look at the images on the internet, you don't see that black spot. It's gone. It seems to be erased. Now I'm sure they can do that with Photoshop, right?
Well, I don't know. I thought it was Nikita Khrushchev. Yeah.
Well, I remember him. He
always kept banging his slipper or whatever it was on the gavel to get everybody's attention. Bang his shit.
Yeah, you're talking about, but that was in the 50s. That was when he was at the United Nations, and he said he would bury us. He took his shoe off and he pounded his heel like bam, 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 bam on the table at the United Nations in New York City, which Rockefeller, by the way, gave the land to the United Nations. He's the guy that started that whole mess. Yeah, Rockefeller gave the land.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So anyway, so the McKinley rocket, what we wanted to do was put a reflector, if you will, kind of like a mirror, but not really a mirror for visual, a mirror for electromagnetic waves. We wanted to send telecommunications. We wanted to send a signal, a radio signal, up to the satellite. But it really wasn't a satellite. It was just a ball. And back then, back in the 30s, there was no plastic. Now, we did have aluminum, and aluminum was a pretty good reflector of radio waves. As a matter of fact, a lot of antennas, like television antennas, remember the TV antennas people used to have on their houses, and they would aim them at the big city so they could get, NBC, CBS, ABC?
Yeah, and you had to then adjust it. After you designed it and everything else, then you had to tweak it just to make it actually work.
Right, and they would have directors and reflectors. So some of the elements of these antennas, and they were gold anodized at one time, but before they were gold anodized, they were just plain old clear anodized, or they were just mill-finished aluminum. But they would have some of the elements which would be directors, which would direct the signal back to the active elements, and then there would be reflectors behind the active elements, and it would reflect the signal forward. So you would get gain, or you get more decibels of signal by these antennas. Well, they knew that worked. So what they wanted to do was put something up in space that they could transmit a signal to, and in a different location on the Earth from the transmitter, they could receive that signal. And it was just simply like a reflector. And that was the plan. But the problem was they were going to use Bakelite. And that was invented by a guy named Bakelund. And it was like you remember Bakelite, right? It was resistant to heat. They made distributor caps and rotors out of Bakelite. But the problem was if they launched it in space, it would crack because of the vacuum in space. So we're going to a break. We'll continue this. Dr. Richard Allen Miller's with us, and we're talking about the first satellite that the United States was working on back in the 1930s. This is like historical information, if you want to call it that. And so in 1907, there was a gentleman by the name of Leo Baekeland, Baekeland. And he discovered that if he combined phenol and formaldehyde, he could make this hard substance that was a dielectric. And so he figured that this product could have a lot of uses. Well, when we wanted to put our first reflector in orbit, we were going to use Bakelite. But the problem with Bakelite is the Castrolm zone of the ionosphere would cause it to crack. It couldn't take the impact nor the or the vibration of the Castrol zone. So what they decided to do, they wanted to use aluminum anyway. So they had to invent plastic. So that, necessity is the mother of invention, right? You remember that, Rick, right? Necessity is that's why a lot of products come out of the space race and war, right? Necessity.
I thought that was just because we were looking on how to make plastic.
No, we needed the plastic. We needed the plastic because
I thought, wasn't it? He did everything in plastic.
Right, better living through chemistry.
That's right.
Right, he had that on the back. That was on his license plate. If you rode around in the first state, which is known as Delaware, which is a tiny state. Yeah, some places it's only 13 miles wide. But if you had a chance to see Governor Pete DuPont, his license plate said "Better Living Through Chemistry." But they had so many crashes with their tanker trucks, and so many people got killed that they decided to take their name off the trucks. Because people would say, there's another DuPont truck causing a catastrophe. Super fun cleanups as a result of, just those guys driving down the road and running into abutments. But anyway, so Bakelite was not the right substance, so they had to invent plastic. And what they did was they mixed plastic with aluminum dust, really almost the atomic level of aluminum dust. And that's Mylar. That's Mylar. And it's really strong. But the problem is, when they put it on top of the rocket, they couldn't leave it fully inflated. So they made a ball, kind of like maybe 3 feet in diameter. And they wanted to put that in space, in the Clark belt. And did you, by the way, didn't you have something to do with Arthur C. Clarke?
I'm outside, so I can't hear very good. Say again?
Didn't you have something to do with Arthur C. Clarke?
Well, no, it was a Stranger in a Strange Land and neo-paganism and, dropping out and becoming, that's where I started all my whole thing when I was in grad school. When I came out of grad school, I joined the Church of All Worlds, started writing for Green Egg. Can you imagine?
The Green Egg, I thought the Green Egg was like a barbecue type grill that had a ceramic material?
No, that was the one that was on the moon, that woman with that ray gun shot him. But no, it was Arthur C. Clarke, I think it was, the Stranger in a Strange Land, before Eating Raoul.
So what, this aluminum Mylar, we'll call it a balloon, it had to be flat packaged. They just couldn't put a balloon on top of a rocket because it would break. So they put it in a flat package. But then when they got to the altitude that they wanted, which was in the Clark Belt, it was about 22,236 miles up. That's called the Clark Belt. And that's, if you put something at that distance from the Earth, it'll tend to stay there. Now it'll move forward, backward, left, right, east, west, a little bit up, down. But, for a while it'll stay in place. And they thought that was the place to put this balloon, this reflector balloon. But the problem that they had was they couldn't inflate the balloon on the ground. They had to inflate it when it was right where they wanted it to be. So they had to invent a timer. And because we didn't have signals at that point that could transmit the telemetry information to launch the balloon and inflate the... Oh, geez, we're out of time again. We'll continue this when we get back. Dr. Richard Allen Miller's with us, and we're talking about the first satellite, which was a reflector. Mylar. And the space race. And the Cold War. We'll be right back. So maybe we're spending a little more time on the detail than we should, but I don't know how else to do this, Rick. So the problem was this balloon had to be inflated when it was at the right altitude, but it couldn't be inflated in the rocket. So what they did was they had a deflated balloon, and they decided that hydrogen was the gas that they should inflate the balloon with, because hydrogen, from what I remember, is the lightest substance on the planet. It's the most simple atom on the planet. Is that right, Rick?
Well, it's one of them. I know that in the periodic chart they have different weights, but I forget how Mendeloff did all of that.
Okay, well, let's just assume that it's one of the lightest, okay? Now, they could have used helium, but helium is a little bit heavier than hydrogen, but hydrogen is explosive. So they were worried about when they inflated this balloon, it might actually explode, and the whole project would be wasted because of the explosion of this balloon. And that was the whole purpose, to put this balloon in space to act as a reflector in the Clark belt. Well, so what they did was they sent up the balloon on the rocket, and they had to, at the right moment, the right second, they had to fill the balloon with this gas. So what they did was they looked at what kind of timers. I mean, we didn't have solid-state electronics back then, so they had a mechanical timer, and they looked to one of the world's most well-known timers, and that was Big Ben in London.
I thought it was Timex that kept on ticking.
Well, that's true. That's true. But Timex is a derivative of West clocks, and West clocks is spelled Westclox. And West clocks, for the government, developed what was called the Baby Ben. And that was a wind-up alarm clock with little bells on it, so you could set the time that you wanted to wake up or what time you wanted the alarm to go off, and it would go off. But that made no sense in using that for this rocket. But what did make sense, instead of ringing the bell with a clapper, they had the clapper hit a switch, and the switch turned on a little circuit that had nichrome wire in it, and the nichrome wire heated up, and when it melted, the retainer, the firing pin would launch against this little tiny cylinder of hydrogen. Remember when we used to make club soda with these little CO2 cylinders? They were little green cylinders, and they had these steel-encased netted bottles, and you could make your own club soda. Did you ever do that?
I didn't, no. But I did remember doing the flat Earth experiment with the balloon.
Okay. Well, didn't you have to worry about the edge?
No, I just discovered that it was flat.
Okay. Well, actually, I guess it wouldn't make much difference. I suppose you wouldn't even need to even put this reflective ball up in the Clark belt, because the Earth is flat anyway. I mean, because the line of sight is the problem with communications. That's why we needed this reflector in the first place, because they thought, at that time, they thought the Earth was a sphere. And that's one of the reasons why they used a sphere for the balloon.
Well, that's why the Buddhists,
but getting back to
their sun got up onto the highest mountain so that you'd get there quicker. I think that missing spacecraft that's on the other side of the moon is Buddhist. I think so. And worse, I think there's something else there, maybe the Nazis. I saw something on Netflix like that.
Was it a documentary?
No, it was, I forget what it was, something about Dr. Strangelove riding some kind of a missile with Slim Pickens.
Yeah, I remember. Didn't he ride that missile? I mean,
I thought so, like
wasn't
a
he
cowboy. Yeah, it was out of a rodeo or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. So back to this little project that we worked on. Actually, it was a big project. It involved everybody was watching us, all the countries throughout the world who had newspapers were following this story back in the 1930s. So what they did was they had this Baby Ben clock, and West Clock had to build a Baby Ben clock, and that was the timer. So they precisely set the time, knowing the launch velocity, so that at the right second, this Baby Ben alarm clock would go off, and it would throw the switch. And they had to have a battery. And by the way, they couldn't use lead-acid batteries. Back then, car batteries and truck batteries were 6 volts, but they were lead-acid, and they had to have vent caps on them. And they couldn't use that because the acid would spill out into space and the battery wouldn't work. So they had like a contest. Who could make a leak-proof battery? And, of course, there was the Eveready Battery Company and the Rayovac Battery Company and the Mallory Battery Company. And those three companies were in competition. But what happened was the Eveready leaked, the Mallory leaked, and the Rayovac leaked, the Mallory leaked. But what Eveready did was they came up with this plastic film. It was kind of a stretchy plastic film, and they lined the zinc casing of their carbon zinc dry cell. They were called D cells back then, the letter D, as in David. They lined it with this plastic film, and today we call that saran wrap. Anyway, so it didn't leak, and they used these D cells. They had 4 of them, and they were 1.5 volts apiece. And in series, that was 6 volts, and that was enough to melt the retainer to hold back the firing pin so that the spring wouldn't launch prematurely. And it would wait until the West clock baby Ben hit the time that the alarm was set for, and off it would go. The battery would melt the retainer, the firing pin would launch, the balloon would fill up and go out into space. And it would stay there for a while. But the solar winds, that was a big problem back then. You remember that? The solar winds?
I don't. I remember working in series and parallel with batteries. But, boy, that's where I learned how to be a boy scientist. It was that little workbook that we had. A boy engineer. Do you remember those books?
Well, I do remember the Erector set. I do remember the Chemcraft chemistry set.
Yeah, Chemcraft chemistry sets. I used to make rocket ships. Actually, I was learning how to make a pipe bomb, but I called it a rocket ship. And I remember going out to these big gravel pits to see how good I did. I put fins on the thing and everything. But it was a pipe bomb.
Yeah, well, if you opened up one end, it wouldn't be a pipe bomb. It would be a rocket, right? That's the difference
then that's how it worked, And what I did is I folded the metal over so it would be just enough that when the explosion went off, it would blow out the end, and hopefully the fins would keep it stable. It didn't work. I found it in a neighbor's garage, rough, 6 blocks away. That was a long time ago when I did that.
Yeah. That was when it was okay, and people didn't get arrested for that kind of stuff, right?
No, you learned how to mix just the right amount of sulfur with saltpeter and carbon, and you could make gun cotton with a little bit of nitric acid, and then you could go downhill from there and really have fun.
Now, gun cotton is simply, from my memory, gun cotton is simply cotton, like a ball of cotton dipped into nitric acid.
Nitroglycerin and a couple of other acids, and then it would, put behind a door, and then when they opened the door would explode off the hinges. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I got kicked out of school for doing that.
Yeah, I didn't get quite to that point, but the getting kicked out part. So what we did was we now have this reflective ball made out of mylar in the Clark belt, and it's geosynchronous, so it's staying sort of put where we left it. But the problem was the solar wind would kind of blow it east or west. And so they had to come up with, this is before they launched it. They knew this was going to be a problem. So they came up with these little kind of, we'll call them parachutes. And they put a parachute on the east side and a parachute on the west side, tied on. And the idea was if they had a fan, and this is way before electronics and jet propulsion. So, we were using mechanical means to make things happen. These were the early days, the 1930s. So we had this fan, and they had a contest who could make the fan for this particular space launch. And it was a company called Emerson. And Emerson made really good fan blades, and they had electric motors. And they made one that ran on DC, which was a pretty big deal. And so the fan would blow against these 2 parachutes. They actually had 2 fans, one on the east side, one on the west side. And what happened was Emerson made the fan and the fan motor and the fan blades. And in order to cut costs, they had one stamping of the fan blades. So the plan was to put the fan blades on one way on the east side and just turn the fan blade over for the west side, and it would work fine because both fans would push against these little parachutes, which were like sails. But when Emerson made it, they forgot to turn over the other fan blade. So what happened was one pushed and one pulled. And that's why Emerson doesn't make fans anymore. because the mistake was so great, they had to stop making fans because nobody would buy an Emerson fan because they knew they didn't work. So they had to start making air conditioning compressors and air conditioning units, window units. So, that's a story about Emerson. So anyway, the idea was that the solar wind was the big problem. And they had to, and these D cells that were made by Eveready had to last long enough so they could turn on these fans to push this reflective mylar ball back into the box. We'll call it a box. And that would be up, down, east, west, so that it would be in the right position to reflect the signals from the transmitter on Earth. And that was built by a company called Radio Corporation of America. You remember those guys?
No, I remember Heathkit. That's what I remember.
Well, okay. Well, the problem was that in order to make the transmitter work properly, it had to be cold. Electronics work, some electronics. Electronics that don't have moving parts seem to work best when it's cold. That's why computers need to have cooling fans, because if they get warm, I'm talking about today's computers, if they get warm, they overheat and they stop working. They kind of melt down. So and that's why we had to buy Alaska. Remember Sword's Icebox?
Well, no, I don't. I don't remember any of that. I was mostly working with Lionel trains.
Okay. Well, I guess we went to different schools together, Rick.
Yeah.
So I learned about Seward's Icebox, and Russia owned Alaska. And for a few $1 million, we bought Alaska. And nobody wanted it. Well, we were told nobody wanted Alaska because it was just not ice. But for this space project, we needed Alaska because we needed to put the transmitter in the ice to keep it cool so that we get enough radio transmission. We'll call it, it's not bandwidth, it would be the equivalent of amperage. Actually it was in watts, right? They measured it in megawatts. Back then you needed a lot of power in order to reach the Clark belt. So we had to bury the transmitter in the ice. And in order to do that, we needed a big block of ice. And the biggest block that we could find was Alaska. So we bought Alaska. And the Russians had no idea that that's why we wanted to buy Alaska, because of the space race.
I see, yeah.
Yeah, we'll be right back. So as a result, there were all kinds of problems, but there were some benefits to the first satellite. So Eveready claimed that they could build a leak-proof dry cell. And so they invented saran wrap to keep the dry cells from leaking. And that worked. But the Mallory batteries had all kinds of problems. Even though they were innovative and they created all kinds of inventions, they had pollution problems. And in 1978, they ended up getting bought by Dart Industries. And you know them today as Duracell. But they did not enter the production of the first satellite. And then Rayovac batteries, well, they still leak. So they'd be like the stepchild of the battery industry. And Radio Corporation of America, they couldn't get the transmitter to work. So they had to change their name. So instead of being called Radio Corporation of America, they changed their name to RCA. And they started making 78 RPM records. So they became like a record company. So that's the story of the first attempt that the United States had at making a reflective type of satellite.
There's a memory effect, in nickel-cadmium batteries, especially the rechargeable ones. If a nickel-cadmium battery is recharged before it's fully discharged, it forgets that it's able to discharge any more energy. Did you know that?
Yeah. So what you're saying
is, for example, pretend a battery is capable of storing 100 units of energy.
Mm-hmm.
If you use 40 units, then charge the battery up to 100 units. In your mind, the battery contains 100 units, but the memory effect means the battery essentially only can release up to 40 units of energy.
Yeah, so it thinks now this is nickel cadmium. So
yeah.
It thinks it used to think that dead was 0 and fully charged was 100. But if you bring it down to 40% and then you charge it, now it thinks the bottom being dead is 40%. And then, so if you keep charging it when it's almost fully charged, then it thinks maybe the bottom is 95%. So you've lost most of the storage capacity of the nickel-cadmium battery because of the memory effect. That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah, but the energy used to manufacture a rechargeable or single-use battery is 50 times greater than the electrical energy that they produce when they are being discharged. Did you know that?
And is that why the
China
Tesla?
They make all the batteries now. Yeah.
Who does?
China. Or China.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Yes.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, I think that's why the Tesla is having so many problems. So when it first starts out, let's say it goes 100 miles on a full charge, then you charge it, and then tomorrow it goes 99 miles.
And one nickel-cadmium mobile phone or power tool battery is enough to pollute 600,000 liters of water. That's equivalent to a third of an Olympic-sized swimming pool.
Mm-hmm. And we had nowhere near that amount of pollution when we had the carbon zinc battery, right? Because we could reuse the remaining zinc.
Yeah, but the term heavy duty is often misleading. There are no really industrial standards for batteries, so many times the terms used for battery manufacturers become misleading. You know, they say it's heavy-duty batteries are often the least powered batteries you can buy. Did you know that?
Well, you're probably talking about Harbor Freight because they call.
I am, as a matter of fact, under China. Yeah.
Yeah, if you pick up a whole 24-pack of Harbor Freight batteries, you know, whatever that, I believe it's about 24. These little AA cells in a package. It doesn't weigh very much, and you go, geez, you know, there's not much mass here. How can they make a heavy-duty battery that weighs hardly anything? Well, all you have to do is try one and see how long it lasts, and heavy-duty is a relative term. So you'll find out that a Harbor Freight dry cell, which is the old type of carbon zinc battery, actually, it's a dry cell. It's really not a battery. You have to have a couple dry cells at least in series to make a battery. So a battery is multiple dry cells. But we call them batteries, even though they're not batteries. We use that generic term. But the Harbor Freight is probably the worst dry cell in terms of capacity on the planet. And if you weigh one of them, and let's say you weigh a Duracell or an Energizer or even a leaky Rayovac, they weigh way more than the Harbor Freight heavy-duty cells, right?
I remember when fuel cells were being made, and the Daniel cell was when they put a copper plate inside the bottom of a glass, and a copper sulfate solution was poured over the plate. Then you had zinc to worry about.
And the result was, what would you do with all the hydrogen that it made, right?
Well, then that's what caused global warming.
And you know, it's really interesting because people think it's not that. They think it's Freon.
Yeah, well, you know, zinc is for old men.
Yeah. Rick, we're going into top of the hour break, news and commercial announcements. What would you like to?
Other than buy my books, I'm desperate. Starving Artist comes to mind. There's lots more where that came from.
How do we buy your books, Rick?
Go directly to my website, richardalanmiller.com. Go to the bookstore.
Everyone all set? Cocked? Locked? Hour number 2 of a USA Preparedness with Dr. Richard Allen Miller, our resident doctor of physics. And Richard Allen Miller has a PhD, and he is we call him Dr. Richard Allen Miller. So, Rick, just to recap, oh, by the way, I just looked at our ratings, and I'm not kidding about this class. Rick, I'm not kidding. Our ratings right now are the highest they've been in years. So it seems to me that people are really, and I'm not kidding, people are really interested in learning about physics and history and things that, well, we didn't learn in school. So just to recap what we talked about during the first hour, we talked about Big Ben in London being the model for the Baby Ben. And the Baby Ben was the timer. that was used in the first space launch for the reflective satellite, which was called ECHO. And then back in the 1950s, there was another satellite called ECHO 1. But ECHO 1 really wasn't the first one. The first one was called ECHO. And then we talked about, Baby Ben being the timer, the mechanical timer for the launch of the first reflective satellite, and how, there was the Duracell, which was a result of the Mallory battery company not being able to make a leak-proof dry cell, but Eveready did, and they came up with a battery that they said had 9 lives. That was their claim to fame, and it wouldn't leak because they invented Saran wrap. And in Rayovac batteries, we talked about them, and they still leak. And then we talked about the thermo-Kazarian effect of gasoline molecules when they're heated and cooled, so that you can buy gasoline in the early part of the day and save money. And if you do this over a lifetime, you might save a couple % on your total lifetime fuel expenses. So you should do that. And that's, and then we talked about the Volkov transformer with the hydrogen in the Clark belt, and how that was, we first thought that was going to be a big problem. There would be an explosion. But in the absence of oxygen, hydrogen does not explode. So we really didn't have to worry about that. Then we talked about Bakelite and how it cracks when it's exposed to the sarcometric effects and the solar winds. And then we talked about the Emerson Fan Company, and because of one guy making a mistake and putting the fan blade on backwards, caused Emerson to lose their customers in the fan business. So they had to become an air conditioning company and make air conditioning compressors and using a refrigerant, because the companies didn't want a fan that blew backwards. I mean, people would talk about Emerson. They say, well, why would you buy one of those? The fans blow backwards. So, I mean, it just about killed the entire company until they figured out that air conditioning compressors were the way to go. And then we talked about the parachute company that made these, we'll call them convex parachutes that were tethered to the east and west sides of the reflective ball, and they were used by the fan to put the ball right in the box. And that company that made those was the International Latex Company. And you know them today. They have a different name.
Is that Legos?
No, that's Playtex. Playtex.
Oh, I thought it was.
Cross your heart. Yeah, they made the parachutes.
Huh.
Well, actually, first they made the parachutes, and they said, this is such a good idea. There must be something we could use these things for. So they put 2 of them together, and they used the bridge truss construction principle. And do you remember Cross Your Heart, Playtex? Do you remember that?
Is that how we changed the ratings?
The bridge truss technology?
Yeah.
I don't know. But seriously, the ratings are up.
Imagine
so we
that.
should imagine
Just
that.
because we're doing nonsense. Imagine that. I don't get it, but I got it. By George, I think the rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain.
So Rick, seriously, our ratings have improved during the previous hour and 10 minutes of newspeak, double speak. Seriously, and I didn't get a chance to talk about the deuterial longitude, or some of the other scientific terms that we were going to discuss. And maybe in another broadcast we can talk about.
What did you want to talk about? I'm good for it. I'm always game for it. Let's do it.
So, Rick, what was your reaction to that non-stop hour and 10 minutes of almost pure nonsense?
Well, it felt like doing TV.
Did it really?
Jiggle TV. So, just clearing the mind, letting it just kind of flow wherever it really wanted to, and not really trying to be precise.
Mm-hmm.
But we were.
No, a lot of the things that we said were real terms, but they were intermixed with other words in a sentence that were absolutely fictitious. Okay.
Well,
so,
I'd really like to go back to the space program and actually talk about exactly what is and is not truly happening. They used to blow holes in the ionosphere so that they could get an astronaut through that without, somehow turning them into fried chicken, Colonel Sanders style.
Well, that was always a problem. It really was. And I don't think we solved it.
That's what HARP and other things were used, was to create these holes in the ionosphere and the Van Allen belt so that they could slide something through quick. But once you got out on the other side, you're still getting gamma rays. And guess what happens next? Your LD50 ratio is lethal dose 50. That means exposure to that amount of radiation, 50% die right out of the gate. And so did the moon landing happen?
So in all seriousness,
what's that?
In all seriousness, I believe what you're saying, and so we're actually going back to real science, not doublespeak now.
Why?
So in real,
let's doublespeak and see if they can figure out when we really are starting to do confabulation, because that's what conspiracy is truly all about. A little bit of this and a whole lot of that, and you remove the daily because it's just for flavor.
So if I understand what you're saying, so the Lucarian effect of the explosion by boring the hole in the ionosphere that would temporarily push away the radioactive particles so we could sneak through before it closed back up.
That's why they had timing on why that missile had to go when it did and when they were 5, 4, 3. Because when they had to go through that hole, and the Challenger was when they tried to do a cavitation ball around it so that they could protect the astronauts with a cavitation air bubble or something that would allow it to do into outer space without having to go through the Van Allen belt. That's what the Chinese did with their supersonic torpedo.
All right. So are we still doing that? But because I'm concerned about the holes.
It's all part of hokey pokey, and you turn your left foot, turn it all about.
But
science
if we
doesn't have the answers any more than religion. In fact, they're the same thing from different sides with Malcolm somehow in the middle. And when you realize that science has a bunch of assumed truths, did you know that, the shortest distance between 2 points is no longer a straight line? Now, that assumption allowed us to create and understand our universe as being round and balls out in space. However, space and time are not real. They're not really real. What they are confabulations in the way men, not dolphin, think. And we gather things in this way. David Bohm wrote his book, what was it called, Implicate Order, where he talked about different similarities and similar differences. And what that led to was the whole concept of, now that we know that space is no longer a straight line between one point and another, that it actually is curved. Well, now with tensor math, I can prove the Earth's flat. So, is the Earth flat or round? And the correct answer is yes, because space, as we conceive it, is an assumed truth with definitions. And that's where science fails.
And when you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe you said that the shortest distance between 2 points is no longer a straight line. So
that's right.
I was thinking about
in solid state physics, we observed a thing called event horizons and precursor waves. And part of the crystal would send a notice through the rest of the crystal that an event was about to happen. It was, the future, talking about what is about to happen.
So when Stephen Hawking was talking about the Gabluic transition, And he said that, so like, for example, if you have like 2 points, and like an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, and you have 1 point at the top of the page and 1 point at the bottom of the page, you think, well, you could just measure that with a ruler, how far they are apart. But if you were to fold that piece of paper, bend it in the shape of a C, so you bring the top of the page closer to the bottom of the page, you have the Glabuic transition. And then, so it's actually shorter distance. Is that what you're talking about?
Sort of like trying to form a rapid transit system from Zurich to Fermilabs in Chicago. CERN. That's what they're doing. They're bending space. That's the so-called God particle. That's the idea that space is curved and that we can tunnel going from here to there and do something instantaneous outside of space-time. Time is also not real. What it is a basic a confabulation of the way you store memory. And a duration is a concept that was developed on terms of how you define something. Are we there yet? And time is experienced.
And that's the age-old question. That's the age-old question. You said it right there. I mean, that's the point. So when we talk about CERN and we talk about just this tunneling effect, we're talking about using an enormous amount of energy to get from here to there.
Well, no, a lot of gamma ray comes in from outer space. It hits a crystal and it causes lattice damage, just like the darkening in your plastic that we were talking about earlier in a sports car. At some point, plastic turns dark, and you have to replace it because of sunlight.
And so that explains why we have to get new headlights all the time with these new plastic headlights. And glass was better, right? Glass didn't tarnish quite as quickly, right? But plastic. So that actually rearranges the molecules on the surface of the Lexan lenses. Is that right? Is that what you're saying?
I have no idea.
So, class, if you would like to learn more about physics and science, you can go to Dr. Richard Allen Miller's website, and you can buy his books. And if you get them directly from him, you can have them autographed and personalized, and that's what mine are. And those are the most important books in my collection, the ones that have been personalized by the author, like Dr. Richard Allen Miller. So that website is
I should say something, Vincent, that my website has been experiencing burps. That means the bandwidth, because I did something stupid. What I did is I put all my ebooks and the metaphysics on my same site for downloading when people would order them. Well, some of those are over a gigabyte each. And even though I have so-called unlimited bandwidth, my current server has got some serious flaws, because when I wanted to try to make an order, what would happen is that it would forget my zip code, and I'd have to go back, and it would say that's not listed, and I couldn't place the order. Now, we're moving everything over to a Dropbox so that everything's going to be, hopefully that's going to take care of the problem. But be persistent. If you want to order from me, that's one of the things that I'm now learning about websites and why you do things this way over that way. And nobody knows these things until you figure them out for yourself, because there's no book out there that runs it down to you. I thought I was hacked. I probably was, and bandwidth. So just be persistent, because I'm fixing it what I did is I put a big download library, free books downloaded. That was a great thing, except that when you do that, it slows my site down. People can't order books, even though I've given them away free.
And what you're talking about is kind of like gardening. And, those who say, I've got some seeds, I'm good to go, so when the collapse happens, I'll just plant my seeds. Well, if you don't experience planting seeds and seeing how it actually works, the amount of failures that you're going to experience are going to be huge. So you really need to get experience right away. And, Rich, we were talking about, Dr. Richard Allen Miller, we were talking about, the first satellite project really was not a complete failure. We ended up with saran wrap, but the problem with saran wrap is
plastic, and do you know that more things are overpackaged, and there's more money in the actual packaging of something than the product itself. Welcome to Better Living of Chemistry, and why DuPont and Rockefeller are now the leading, bankers in the world. That's how they did it.
And that's why you should not go to Starbucks, because just about every cup of coffee that leaves Starbucks leaves with trash that you will be throwing away. I'm here in the studio. I'm enjoying a cup of coffee while we're broadcasting, and I have been using the same mug for at least 8 years. At least. And it says USA Prepares on it. It's a black coffee mug. It's my favorite coffee mug. And I've been using these coffee mugs for at least 8 years. So how does that compare to, a couple cups of coffee every day, throwing out the cups in the trash just as soon as you've had an 8, 10, 12 or larger coffee? It's crazy. Crazy to me that we are so careless with the environment. And it's, saran wrap starts out with the first attempt at a reflective satellite launch, a reflective ball in the sky. And now as a result, we've polluted the ocean. So if we never had that first reflective ball in the sky, we wouldn't have the pollution in the ocean, because we wouldn't have saran wrap and all of its derivatives.
Well, if you think America's bad in terms of the use of plastic, you ought to see what's happening over in Asia right now with the plastic washing in on the shores down in South America. It's unbelievable.
And it's not just plastic. These large cruise ships, they collect all the flushes from all the toilets on the cruise ships and the tankers and the ocean-going ships. And then there's the big flush, and into the ocean it goes. Robert in Kansas is going to be with us right after the bottom of the hour commercial break. Robert, please stay with us. Dr. Richard Allen Miller, and I'll be right back. We're broadcasting with Dr. Richard Allen Miller today, and we've been talking about the transductive and dielectric properties of plastic in combination with the salinity of the ocean's water as an electrolyte, and how the wavelengths of the sun, when refracted through the salt water, causes plastics to resist decomposition. Robert in Kansas, you're on with Dr. Richard Allen Miller. Welcome.
Hey, Vincent, good morning. And Dr. Miller, thank you for everything you do, putting out the information.
You bet.
You really help a lot of people. I want you to know that. I had a question kind of along the lines of what you guys were talking about. I figured my senior instructors might be able to help me.
No, I'm not a senior instructor. Robert, I'm not a senior instructor. I'm just a plain old instructor. Dr. Richard Allen Miller is a senior instructor.
No, Vince, you're a senior, and you have to be, or I can't be an instructor. So you're a senior instructor.
Well, thank you for the promotion.
Yeah, you've been promoted. Dr. Miller talks about the polymath thing, and I just want, Vincent, you might not have a doctorate in something, but you've worked on so many things. You got to think of it in those terms. I mean, that's a type of intelligence too, Doctor. You would listen to him about physics, right? But you do a lot of different things, Vince. So you're definitely a senior instructor. You can't push away that responsibility now.
Well, I'll resist to the best of my ability, but I appreciate the kind words, Robert.
Yeah, no, you're actually right in there, Vincent, rapping along like the boy scientist.
I was thinking today as we were going through some of the science that we've discovered and been talking about today, and I was thinking, so which one of our instructors will be the first to call, if any? Because, I mean, we really went into depth on a lot of things that people just frankly don't talk about. And I thought that Robert in Kansas would be calling, and sure enough, here he is.
So my first question question. I have a couple things, but the question I have is pretty short. Why is moonlight cooler than moonshade?
It has to do with the phase of the moon and how close the moon is to the Earth. Actually, the moon itself is in the atmosphere of Earth. That's a brand new, it actually is. And so when it moves back and forth in, solstices and equinoxes, shortest and longest days, that affects our atmosphere and the kind of temperature right out of the gate. It's a gravity thing. Before we even talk about how close it is and what it's doing to the fields, the magnetic fields, like the tides of the ocean.
And it also has to do with
That's one of the reasons why also the old almanacs used to farm using when you planted your crop in daylight or in moonlight, because it made a difference in terms of how it would sprout and how it would grow. Now, that's hokey pokey, but it's not really. It actually had validation. And now, I'd like to even go further. It turns out that Prague, back in the 70s, when they did their so-called psychic discoveries behind the Iron Curtain, had a new development in astrology, which went from astrology to astronomy, and then it was called cosmobiology. We had biorhythms where there were 5 different rhythms that your body was, tuned to, and sometimes you were in sync with yourself, and sometimes you weren't, because the cycles were different. And Janov came up with the thing called the lunar sex cycle of the female, that where she's born sets an ovulation cycle in her body, that if she moves to a different part of the Earth, the ovulation cycle changes because of the phase of the moon. Now, what I did, which was interesting, was the planet Neptune. And this was a Department of Interior project where they wanted to know, is it true that when Uranus and the Earth and the Sun were in a certain geometric alignment, there was a 3 sigma error coefficient on a major earthquake occurring on the Earth? And that was our first attempt to try to develop a accurate prediction system for earthquakes. And it turns out, what I did is a 360 computer at the UW, and I went and searched all the way back in history, and I validated that every time the Neptune was in a, not Neptune, Uranus was in a specific geometric alignment with the Earth and the Sun, a major earthquake occurred. Now, that's impossible because we have no known laws on how the planet Uranus, as far away as it is, and as small as it is, as a mass, would have any effect at all on the Earth. And yet, there was a 3 sigma. That means 99.99975% probability that it would occur. And the Department of Interior was used that until now. We have a more accurate thing dealing with the Sun and solar minimums, grand solar minimums, and these kinds of things that occur and how the Sun affects the Earth. But back then, it was called cosmobiology. And believe me when I tell you this, the storms on Jupiter were related to the angst of humans on Earth being affected by the storms of Jupiter. That's a metaphor. And the thing is, that would suggest that space and planets are not what we think they are. They are constructs in our mind's eye to understand our universe. And that's why a lot of Aborigines and some of the older races actually have a sense that there are dream times or sleep states that have more content to reality than consciousness does. And that we right now are basically asleep.
I thought you were going to talk about the stochastic theory of circular movement of light particles and wavelengths, and the form that they take is kind of a spiraling tunneling effect. And by the way, that's the exact same mechanism that Elon Musk is using for his boring machines. He's using spiraling tunnel effect, which is known as the stochastic theory of circular movement of light particles and wavelengths. But he wasn't the first. You know, a lot of people think that he was the first guy to bore these tunnels, but he wasn't. In 1897 was the first subway in Boston. So they were tunneling well over 100 years ago. Robert?
There's tunnels that go from Scotland, all the way down to Turkey. And that was dug by Göbekli Tepe. Those underground things was a race of individuals before they were Scotland and Turkey that burrowed underground for survival systems because of what is about to happen to us.
And so what happens if the grid goes down, Rick?
I'm going to say that if you have your water together, that's going to give you an additional 50% chance of survival, no matter what else is happening. The creepy part is, even California has nuclear power plants on top of major fault lines. And it's crazy that they don't have any way. You can't turn those off. Just turn them off. It takes like as much as a year to cool those things down. And you're not going to have that because of New York and Quebec and what those blackouts and the grid down situation implied. And that's where we are right now in technology, and isn't better living through chemistry. We're not in a very good situation.
When our friend Jerry Pollack talks about the fourth zone of water, he talks about that. And so how does that relate to emulsifying water with just a small amount of a petrochemical? We could call it gasoline, we could call it diesel fuel, we could call it motor oil. So if we emulsified a small amount of petrochemical with water in the fourth zone, will we be able to make a vehicle that will pollute very, very little as compared to gasoline or diesel today?
You know, water is the bottom line, and the first two things, 50% of the earth will die from dehydration and exhaustion, of trying to do too much in a situation where it needs to be done over a period of time with certain kinds of rest and things like that. Those are the two first primary killers of any kind of event, whether it's a pandemic, a grid down situation, earthquake, hurricane, whatever. They're all, and we're probably going to have them all. Nobody knows what's really going to happen. You know, you don't know. But what you can do is that you can try to be a little more dependent. Do you know how many people depend on their cell phone today? How fragile that technology is in terms of a grid down situation, and all of a sudden everything stops, your computer. The purpose of having a book as opposed to an e-book for your knowledge base. You know, just even the day after tomorrow, it was the Gutenberg Bible and that thing that saves those guys' lives because they could burn it. You know, I mean, as a metaphor. You know, it's just, we have no idea. If you have water together for every 3 days worth, for everyone in your household, animals, whatever, and a backup plan on replacing it the first day, you have already increased the likelihood of survival by a good 50% more than normal. You can't prep for anything. What you can do is try to be, what it's going to be about, you're going to need 10 feet of soil between you and some kind of event if you're in the northern hemisphere shortly. We know that the day after tomorrow must happen. It won't happen long, maybe 3 to 5 days, might be 2 weeks, That's a maximum. That the southern hemisphere, all the currents are gone. The Gulf Streams, they're gone. Where did they go? Well, what that's doing is it's changing the saline or salts levels in the ocean, and that it alone says there's going to be a superstorm. JPL right now, today, is suggesting that by 2024, there will be parts of Canada that are no longer habitable, and that this coming winter may be the worst in recorded history. Look at our summers. I don't know what your summer's like. We have not actually, it's been balmy and mellow. It has not been hot at all. How does that work? I've never seen...
We come back, Robert. When we come back, Robert, I'd love to hear your comments. I know our class would as well. Can you stay with us?
Yeah, Ben, thanks.
Okay. We'll be right back. Dr. Richard Allen Miller, richardallenmiller.com, and Robert in Kansas. Dr. Richard Allen Miller's with us, and we've been talking about the Marissa Lundkins and the resulting columnar-type clouds that are piercing the ionosphere as a result of the chlorofluorocarbons. And while the Earth is continuing to heat up, even Europe is sweltering in the heat. And the resultant cause of the ionic residue is even attaching itself to circuit boards, microelectronic circuit boards, and you mentioned cell phones, Rick. And so what's happening is Apple Computer is now petitioning the U.S. government for an exemption of the 25% tariff, the import tariff, on their computer, the new Mac, which has an MSRP of $6,000, because the ionic residue is so great that we're unable to make it in this country because of our air condition, the poor quality air. So that's just one more component. Robert in Kansas, your thoughts?
Well, Vincent, I called about the moon, but just to comment on the conversation, there's a hard collapse, right, where, the power grid, something like that. There'll be a certain time period after that that's terrible. And it sounds really harsh, but people will eventually find food and water or they won't, and then things will regroup. And then what I worry about also, Vince, is an economic collapse where it's more of it's not a hard collapse, and then you're going to have an inflation-deflation problem, and that's what people are going to be facing here. So those are the things I worry about. But the moon landing is why I called, so if we can talk about that real quick, that'd be great.
Sure. Go ahead.
Well, I was just curious about it because it seems really odd, some of the things that I've learned about the moon landing. And then I also think 50 years later, no military base, no mining, resource extraction, no tourism, hotels, not even a camera, just a camera pointed back at us from the moon. And so I wonder what you guys thought about that and why we haven't been back and why they say they destroyed the technology that got us there and all these crazy things where it's just very, very odd. And so I've got a
quick comment, and then Rick. The reason we haven't been back is because we never got there in the first place. As a matter of fact, I have a telescope.
Well,
I've been looking all over for that flag.
Stanley Kubrick actually came out and made a statement and said that he did the filming of the first staged moon landing, which we did not do when we said we did. And I think all of that was the first time the U.S. government started lying to the public because we were in a space race with Sputnik and trying to be competitive in who could get there first with the best technology. And we there's no way you can go across the Van Allen belt without severe damage to gene pool in a human being. It may not kill you, but you're certainly not going to have children anymore. That's a fact. And I remember when I worked with Edgar Mitchell in the 71 program, when he did Around the Moon, and we did those ESP studies, I remember that when they were going through, just leaving atmosphere, there was real concern. I don't know how they did it. There's no shielding that we had at that time. That was in 71. So Did he do it? Yeah, I was there. I watched it happen, and we did the measurements. But did Buzz Aldrin do his thing? I don't know. I know that he's a very important person politically. And there are physics involved here where, you know, our studies trying to send mice to Mars, nothing lives. We do not yet have any kind of shielding that allows us to be able to do that kind of thing. That's the end of the story. Now, you can punch a hole in the Van Allen belt and slip through there, possibly with light damage, etc. But beyond that, it's not possible. And if they say it is, well, good luck. I don't want to do that. And I actually was going to go to be in the astronaut program, and old man DuPont decided I was too important and had other plans for me. And that's where I am now, a grumpy old man that's a starving artist.
And Rick, if you think about it, you'd have to punch another hole to make it back. But, you know, back then, back in the 1960s, just to prove that we did not go, in my mind, we were trying to develop a writing instrument so that we could take a piece of paper and jot down notes while we're on the moon. Well, we couldn't do it because the gravitational forces, we couldn't make a ballpoint pen that wouldn't leak. Okay, right now our ballpoint pens have a viscosity of the ink so that it won't run out the end of the ink tube, right? So gravity will pull it down and it won't run out. So it's a great viscosity. But we couldn't figure out how to do that in a space capsule because the ink would run out of the ballpoint pen. We couldn't make a ballpoint pen that worked. Now the Russians couldn't do it either. So they said, the heck with the whole thing. We're not going to spend millions of dollars trying to make a ballpoint pen that works in space. We'll just use pencils. And that's the truth.
That's the truth. The problem is there's exposure to gamma rays, high-speed energy particles. And that's, you just...
Imagine getting hit by a candy wrapper at 17,000 miles an hour. You know, we
got 5G or 5 gigahertz up there, not down on the ground like they want to do